Some loves are too powerful to die, even when buried under 20 years of grief and guilt. Sometimes the past returns when we least expect it, forcing us to face the choices that haunt our sleepless nights. War Chief Eirik Bearblood stands at his wedding ceremony, ready to marry a stranger to end the bloodshed between clans. His bride is veiled, her face hidden, until they are bound forever. Eirik expects nothing but duty from this union. But when the veil drops, everything changes. The woman standing beside him is not the young maiden he was promised. She is Liv, his first love, the woman he thought died 20 years ago in a raid he led. Now she stands before him, older but unmistakable, her eyes holding secrets that could destroy them both. Can a love survive when it's built on lies and loss? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like the memories that refused to leave Eirik Bearblood's weathered mind. He stood on the wooden platform overlooking his settlement, watching the sun pierce through the grey veil of dawn. The great hall below buzzed with preparation servants arranging wooden tables, hanging banners, bearing the raven sigil of his clan, and preparing the feast that would seal his fate. Today, at 43 winters old, the most feared war chief of the northern lands would take a bride he had never seen. His hands, scarred from countless battles, gripped the carved railing his grandfather had built. Each mark on his knuckles told a story of violence, of choices made in the heat of blood fury that haunted his quiet moments. The settlement spread before him like a testament to his leadership, sturdy longhouses with smoke curling from their hearths, workshops where smiths hammered steel into weapons and tools, children running between the buildings with wooden swords, their laughter echoing off the mountain walls. You look like a man facing his execution rather than his wedding day. The voice belonged to Tormund the Wise, Eirik's closest advisor, and the only man brave enough to speak such words to the Bearblood. The older man climbed the wooden steps with measured care, his grey beard braided with silver rings that caught the morning light. Eirik turned, his blue eyes reflecting the weight of leadership that had aged him beyond his years. Perhaps there is little difference between the two, old friend. Both require a man to surrender his freedom for the greater good. Tormund approached, his walking staff tapping against the planks. The staff itself was a thing of beauty and power, carved from ancient oak and topped with a bronze raven that had been blessed by the gods. It had belonged to Eirik's father, and his father's father before him, passed down through generations of leaders who had shaped this land with blood and wisdom. Your father would be proud, Tormund said, settling beside Eirik at the railing. When the Eastfell clan approached with this marriage proposal, we all knew it was the path to peace. 20 years of raiding, 20 years of young men dying for old grievances. Today, we end it with words instead of swords. The mention of his father stirred something deep in Eirik's chest. Magnus Bearblood had died when Eirik was barely 25. Leaving him to shoulder the weight of leadership during the bloodiest period their clan had ever known. The raids against the Eastfell had begun over a disputed territory, but like all feuds, it had grown beyond reason, fed by pride and vengeance until whole families had been wiped from the earth. I remember when you first spoke of Liv, Tormund continued, his voice gentle but deliberate. 20 years passed before the great raid that changed everything. She was the daughter of a minor chief from the Eastern Territories, and you loved her with the fire of youth. Eirik's jaw tightened. Liv is dead, Tormund. She died in the raid on Valenheim, along with dozens of others. I led that assault myself, watched the settlement burn. Some wounds never heal. They only teach us to live with the pain. The old advisor nodded slowly, understanding the burden his chief carried. The raid on Valenheim had been a tactical necessity. The Eastfell clan had been using it as a staging ground for their own attacks. But Eirik had discovered too late that Liv was visiting her cousin there, when the war band struck. By the time he fought through to the central hall, the building was already consumed by flames. They found bodies, burned beyond recognition. Liv's silver arm ring was among the ashes, the one he had given her as a promise of marriage that would never come. The bride arriving today is Sigrun, daughter of Chief Arnulf, Tormund said. Young, they say, barely 20 winters. Raised in the traditional ways, skilled in the woman's arts of weaving and healing. She will bring a dowry of cattle, silver, and most importantly, the pledge of her father's sword oath to end this feud forever. Eirik watched a hawk circle high above the settlement, free and untethered. I have dreamed of peace for so long that I had forgotten what it might cost. A man can grow comfortable with war. It has clear enemies and simple rules. Peace requires trust, and trust has always been a luxury I could not afford. Below them, the settlement continued its preparation. Women emerged from their homes carrying baskets of bread and preserved meat for the feast. Children helped gather firewood for the great bonfire that would burn through the night. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil as he put finishing touches on the iron arm rings that would be exchanged during the ceremony. Everything spoke of hope, of a future where children could grow old enough to have children of their own. Tell me about the ceremony, Eirik said, though he knew the rituals by heart. Sometimes speaking of familiar things helped settle the mind before great changes. Tormund straightened, pleased to discuss tradition. The bride will arrive at midday, veiled as custom demands. Her escort will present her to you before the assembled clans. You will exchange oaths before the gods, and only then will the veil be removed to show your people their new lady. The feast will follow, with gift-giving and the binding of the sword oath between the clans. And if the bride finds me wanting? Eirik asked, a trace of humor in his voice. I am not the young warrior I once was. My beard is streaked with grey. My body bears the maps of old battles. You are Eirik Bearblood, Tormund replied firmly. Leader of 300 warriors, keeper of the peace for a dozen settlements, and the man who united the northern clans under one banner. Any woman would be honored to stand beside you. The sound of horns echoed from the southern approach, long and mournful notes that carried across the water. Eirik felt his chest tighten. The bride's party had been spotted on the horizon. Soon, ships would beach on their shores, and strangers would walk into his hall to change his life forever. I have been thinking about legacy, Eirik said quietly. What a man leaves behind when his time comes to join the ancestors. My father left me a strong clan and the wisdom to lead it. What will I leave? A generation raised in war, or the first to know lasting peace? Tormund placed a weathered hand on his chief's shoulder. You will leave both, my friend. The strength to fight when fighting was needed, and the wisdom to choose peace when peace was possible. That is the mark of a true leader. The horns sounded again, closer now. Eirik could make out the shapes of 3 ships moving across the fjord, their square sails billowing with the morning wind. The lead vessel flew the blue and silver banners of the East Fell clan, while the other 2 carried the wedding party's belongings and gifts. I should prepare myself, Eirik said, but he made no move to leave the platform. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and salt water. Once he descended those steps, once he put on the ceremonial robes and golden arm rings of his station, the day would take on a momentum that could not be stopped. One question troubles me, he admitted. In all the negotiations, in all the messages between our clans, why was the bride's face never described? Even Chief Arnulf's emissaries spoke only of her virtue and skill, never her appearance. It seems unusual, Tormund shrugged. Perhaps they follow the old traditions more strictly than we do. Some believe it is bad luck for the groom to know his bride's face before the ceremony. The gods prefer mystery to certainty in matters of the heart. A reasonable explanation, yet something in Eirik's warrior instincts whispered that reason might not be the whole truth. 20 years of leadership had taught him to listen to such whispers. They had saved his life more times than he could count. The ships were close enough now to see individual figures moving on their decks. Soon, he would meet the woman who would share his bed, bear his children, and help him govern their people. The thought should have filled him with anticipation, but instead he felt only the weight of duty and a strange, inexplicable dread. "Come," he said finally, turning from the railing. "Let us prepare to welcome our guests. Today, we write a new chapter in the saga of our people." As they walked toward the steps leading down to the great hall, Tormund's bronze-topped staff caught the sunlight, throwing dancing shadows across the wooden planks. Behind them, the morning mist continued to lift from the fjords, revealing the clear waters that would carry strangers into their lives, and perhaps into the heart of secrets that some believed should remain buried forever. The great hall had been transformed into a temple of ceremony and hope. Tapestries depicting the clan's victories hung from the timber walls, while carved pillars rose like ancient trees toward the smoke-darkened rafters. 300 souls packed the space warriors, craftsmen, women, and children, all gathered to witness the union that would end decades of bloodshed. Eirik stood at the center of it all, wearing the ceremonial robe his grandmother had woven 40 years before. The deep blue fabric was embroidered with silver ravens, each thread telling the story of his lineage. Around his neck hung the golden torque that marked him as chief, its weight familiar but somehow heavier today. The marriage hammer of his ancestors rested on the altar beside him, an ancient weapon blessed by the old gods, used only for the most sacred ceremonies. The massive doors creaked open, and silence fell like a stone into still water. Chief Arnulf of the East entered first, a man nearly as tall as Eirik but leaner, with intelligent grey eyes that swept the hall with careful assessment. Behind him walked his retinue of warriors, their mail shirts polished to mirror brightness, their hands resting on sword hilts in the universal gesture of respectful readiness. Then she appeared. The bride moved between her escorts like a ghost wrapped in white linen, her form graceful despite the heavy wedding robes that concealed her shape. The veil was traditional but unusually thick, falling from a silver circlet to completely shroud her features. Only her eyes were visible through the finest weave, dark as winter nights, steady as stones. "She carries herself like a woman of strength," whispered one of Eirik's houseguards, but something in the bride's bearing struck Eirik as familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with unnamed fear. Chief Arnulf approached the altar, his weathered face bearing the marks of a man who had survived too many winters of war. "Eirik Bearblood," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I bring you my daughter Sigrun, raised in honor and skilled in all the arts that make a worthy wife. She comes willingly to this union, understanding the weight of peace that rests upon her shoulders." The veiled woman stepped forward then, and Eirik noticed something that made his warrior instincts scream warnings he could not name. Her movements were not those of a 20-year-old maiden. There was experience in her stride, confidence born of years and trials. When she inclined her head in formal greeting, the gesture held dignity that only came with maturity. "I accept this union for the good of both our peoples," Eirik replied, the ritual words feeling strange in his mouth. "Let the gods witness what we do here, and let peace flourish where war once grew." The marriage ceremony of the northern clans followed patterns older than memory. Tormund stepped forward with his staff, tapping the wooden floor 3 times to call the attention of the gods. The bride's escort retreated to stand with the East Fell warriors, leaving her alone before the altar. "By hammer and by sword, by fire and by oath, we gather to witness the binding of 2 souls," Tormund intoned. "Let those who would speak against this union step forward now, or hold their peace until the gods themselves may judge." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Somewhere in the crowd, a child coughed, and the sound seemed thunderous in the holy quiet. Eirik found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the veiled bride, studying the way she held herself, the familiar tilt of her head when she listened, the graceful curve of her hands as they folded before her. "Present the marriage gifts," Tormund commanded. Chief Arnulf's men brought forward a chest bound with iron and bronze, setting it carefully before the altar. When opened, it revealed silver arm rings, golden brooches, and strands of amber that caught the firelight like captured sunshine. The dowry was generous beyond expectation, speaking of genuine desire for peace rather than mere political necessity. Eirik's own gifts were simpler but no less meaningful: a sword forged by his father's smiths, a cloak woven from the finest wool, and a golden arm ring that had belonged to his mother. Each piece represented acceptance, protection, and honor. "Join hands for the binding," Tormund instructed. The moment Eirik's fingers touched hers, the world shifted beneath his feet like a ship in storm. Her hands were not young and soft as he had expected, but mature, with the calluses of a woman who had known work and hardship. More disturbing still, he felt a tremor in her fingers that spoke of recognition, of controlled emotion threatening to break free. Tormund began the ancient words, but Eirik barely heard them. He was studying the veiled face before him, searching for clues to the mystery that made his heart race with impossible hope and terrible fear. The eyes behind the veil seemed to shine with unshed tears, dark pools that reflected depths he thought he had learned to forget. "Do you, Eirik Bearblood, take this woman as wife, to protect and provide, to honor and guide, until the gods call you home?" "I do so swear," Eirik replied, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Do you, Sigrun of the East Fell, take this man as husband, to support and counsel, to honor and follow, until the gods call you home?" The pause lasted heartbeats too long. When the bride finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the silent hall. "I do so swear." That voice. Eirik's knees nearly buckled as memory crashed over him like an avalanche. 20 years fell away in an instant, and he was young again, listening to that same voice speak words of love beside a moonlit lake. It was impossible. It was madness. It was— "Remove the veil," Tormund commanded, raising his staff high. "Let the assembled witness the face of their new lady." Chief Arnulf stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the silver circlet from his daughter's head and drew away the white linen that had concealed her identity. The hall erupted in gasps and murmurs of shock. She was not young. Silver threads wove through dark hair that had once been lustrous black. Lines of laughter and sorrow marked a face that time had refined rather than diminished. But the eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, were unmistakably the same ones that had haunted Eirik's dreams for 20 years. It was Liv. Not Sigrun, daughter of Chief Arnulf, but Liv, daughter of the minor chief who had died in the Valenheim raid. Liv, who was supposed to be bones and ash in a burned settlement. Liv, his first love, his greatest regret, his most cherished memory. She stood before him now, aged but undeniably alive, her gaze meeting his with a mixture of love, pain, and determination that made him forget how to breathe. "Hello, Eirik," she said softly, and her voice carried 20 years of survival, 20 years of secrets, 20 years of a story he had never known. "Did you think the gods were finished with us?" The marriage hammer slipped from Eirik's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a sound like breaking thunder. Around them, the crowd stirred with confusion and whispers, sensing that something far more momentous than a political marriage had just unfolded in their sacred hall. Chief Arnulf cleared his throat, his expression grave but not surprised. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "there are things that should be explained." But Eirik heard nothing beyond the thundering of his own heart and the impossible reality of the woman standing before him. Everything he thought he knew about loss, about guilt, about the price of leadership, had just shattered like ice in spring. Liv was alive. She had been alive all these years, while he carried the weight of her death like a stone in his chest. The great hall spun around him, faces blurring into meaningless shapes as questions crashed through his mind like ravens in flight. How? Why? What did this mean for the peace treaty, for his people, for the life he had built on the foundation of her supposed death? One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The stunned silence stretched until Tormund's bronze-topped staff struck the stone floor 3 times, the sound cutting through the shock like an axe through wood. The old advisor's weathered face showed no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. "The ceremony is complete," he announced to the bewildered crowd. "Let the feast begin as planned. There will be time for questions when the chief and his bride have spoken privately." The great hall stirred uneasily as people began to move toward the prepared tables, but conversations buzzed with confusion and speculation. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking why everyone looked so frightened. Warriors exchanged meaningful glances, hands unconsciously checking weapon hilts. This was not how a peace celebration was supposed to unfold. Eirik stood frozen, his eyes locked on Liv's face as if looking away might make her vanish again. She had changed. Yes, time had etched its story in the lines around her eyes and the silver in her hair, but the essence of her remained unchanged. The stubborn tilt of her chin when facing difficult truths, the way her left hand moved to touch her throat when nervous, the steady gaze that had always seen through his carefully constructed walls. "We need to talk," Chief Arnulf said quietly, stepping closer to the altar. "All of us. There are things that must be said before this goes any further." Eirik finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "My private chambers. Now." He turned to address the crowd, struggling to project the calm authority his people expected. "Continue the celebration. We will rejoin you shortly." But as they moved toward the chief's quarters, Eirik caught fragments of worried conversation. His people were not fools. They understood that something had gone terribly wrong with their carefully planned peace treaty. If the bride was not who she was supposed to be, what did that mean for the agreement? Had they been deceived? Was this some elaborate trap by the Eastfell clan? The private chamber behind the great hall was Eirik's sanctuary, a space where he conducted the serious business of leadership away from the crowd's attention. Animal skins covered the wooden floor, and a small fire crackled in the central hearth. Weapons and shields hung from the walls, each one telling a story of battles won and enemies defeated. A heavy oak table dominated the center, scarred by years of maps and negotiations. Liv entered the room like a ghost, returning to haunt familiar places. Her eyes moved across the space with recognition, lingering on a corner where a simple wooden stool still sat, the same stool where she had once waited while he planned raids and settled disputes. Nothing had changed in this room since she had supposedly died, as if Eirik had unconsciously preserved it as a shrine to their lost love. "Sit," Eirik commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He felt like a man trying to navigate in fog, every step uncertain, every familiar landmark suddenly strange. Chief Arnulf took a seat across from them, his grey eyes moving between Eirik and Liv with careful calculation. "I suppose you want to know how she survived the Valenheim raid." "I want to know why you lied to me," Eirik replied, his hands clenching into fists. "I want to know why you brought her here under false pretenses, why you made me believe I was marrying your daughter." Liv spoke for the first time since the revelation, her voice carrying years of practiced patience. "Because it was the only way to make you listen, the only way to get close enough to tell you the truth about what really happened that night. The night." Even now, 20 years later, Eirik could smell the smoke, hear the screams, feel the weight of the sword in his hand as he cut through the Valenheim settlement like a scythe through wheat. He had led that raid personally, driven by reports that the Eastfell clan was using the settlement as a staging ground for attacks on his territory. "I searched for you," he said quietly, When the fighting was over, when the fires were dying, I went through every building looking for survivors. I found your silver arm ring in the ashes of the main hall. Liv's hand moved unconsciously to her left wrist, where a newer silver band now rested. You found what I left for you to find. I needed you to believe I was dead. Why? The word came out as a ragged whisper. She stood and walked to the small window that looked out over the settlement, her back straight despite the weight of years. Because I was carrying the child of another man. Because I was already married to him when you came to burn our world to ash. The words hit Eirik like a physical blow. He staggered back against the table, his legs suddenly unsteady. A child, a husband. Everything he thought he knew about their love, about her, crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide. Gunnar Ironforge, Chief Arnulf said quietly, a good man, a skilled smith. He died defending the settlement, along with their son. Eirik's vision blurred as the implications crashed over him. I killed your husband. I killed your child. The words tasted like poison in his mouth. You led the raid that killed them, yes. Liv's voice was steady, but he could hear the controlled pain beneath it. But you didn't know they existed, how could you? I had written to you months before, telling you I was going to marry Gunnar, that our childhood promises were just that, childhood dreams that had no place in the adult world. I never received any letter. Because someone intercepted it, Chief Arnulf said grimly. Someone who wanted the war between our clans to continue, who profited from the chaos and bloodshed. Tormund's voice came from the doorway, where the old advisor had been listening. Someone who knew that if Eirik learned of Liv's marriage, he might have called off the raid that started the bloodiest phase of our feud. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Eirik felt the weight of revelation settling on his shoulders like chains. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of believing he had killed the woman he loved through his own reckless leadership, and it had all been built on lies and manipulation. Who? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. We're still investigating, Chief Arnulf replied carefully. But we have suspicions. Someone who had access to messages between the clans. Someone who benefited from the continued fighting. Liv turned from the window, and for the first time since the veil had been removed, she allowed her careful composure to crack. Tears stood in her eyes, but they did not fall. I've spent 20 years planning this moment, Eirik. 20 years gathering evidence, building alliances, waiting for the right opportunity to tell you the truth. And now, Eirik asked, what happens now that the truth is told? Now we finish what someone else started, she replied, her voice growing stronger. We find who orchestrated this deception, and we make them pay for every drop of blood spilled in their game. The marriage hammer lay forgotten on the floor between them, its ancient blessing somehow tarnished by the weight of revealed secrets. Outside, the celebration continued, but inside this room, 3 people faced the reality that their carefully planned peace might crumble before it had even truly begun. The feast continued in the great hall, but the celebration felt hollow, like laughter echoing in an empty tomb. Eirik emerged from his private chambers with Liv at his side, their faces carefully composed masks that fooled no one. The assembled clans watched their every movement, reading the tension in their shoulders, the careful distance they maintained from each other. Tormund had done his best to keep the festivities alive, regaling the crowd with stories of ancient victories and filling drinking horns with ale, but questions hung in the smoky air like vultures waiting to feed. When Eirik finally took his seat at the high table, silence rippled outward through the hall like stones thrown into still water. My people, Eirik began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. You have witnessed something unexpected today. The woman beside me is indeed my bride, bound to me by sacred oath before the gods. But she is not Sigrun of the East Fell, as we were told. Murmurs rose from the crowd, but Eirik raised his hand for silence. She is Liv, daughter of Chief Ragnar the Bold, whom many of you knew in your youth. She was thought dead these 20 years, yet she stands here alive, carrying with her a tale that concerns us all. An elderly warrior near the front stood slowly, his scarred hands gripping his walking stick. "Chief Eirik, if this woman is not who was promised, what does this mean for the peace treaty? Have the Eastfell clan deceived us?" Chief Arnulf rose from his own seat, his weathered face grave but resolute. "There has been no deception by my hand or my intent. Liv came to me 3 moons ago with evidence of crimes committed against both our clans. When she asked to take my daughter's place in this ceremony, I agreed because I believed her cause was just." "What evidence?" called out another voice from the crowd. "What crimes?" Liv stood then, and the hall fell silent. Even after 20 years, even marked by time and sorrow, she commanded attention like a flame in darkness. "Someone has been manipulating our clans for decades, profiting from our blood feud while innocent people died. Someone intercepted messages, spread false information, and ensured that peace could never take root." She reached into her wedding robes and withdrew a small leather pouch, weathered by years of careful preservation. From it, she pulled several pieces of parchment, their edges yellowed with age. "These are letters, communications between the clans that never reached their intended recipients. Messages of peace, overtures, offers of negotiation, warnings of planned attacks that could have been prevented." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. Eirik felt his chest tighten as he recognized the implications. How many deaths could have been avoided? How many families could have remained whole if these messages had reached their targets? Tormund stepped forward, extending his hand. Liv passed the leather pouch to the old advisor, who had served 3 generations of chiefs and could read the ancient script better than most. His eyes moved across the parchments with growing darkness, his face reflecting the weight of terrible understanding. "These bear the seals of both clans," he announced finally, "and dates spanning the past 20 years. If they are genuine, they are genuine," interrupted a new voice from the entrance to the hall. Everyone turned to see a figure stepping from the shadows, a man of middle years, well-dressed but unremarkable, the sort who could blend into any crowd without notice. Several people recognized him as Osric the Scribe, a minor functionary who had served as a messenger between the clans for decades. Eirik's warrior instincts screamed danger, but before he could react, Osric was speaking again, his voice carrying a confidence that seemed at odds with his humble appearance. "I am genuinely impressed, Lady Liv," Osric said, his tone almost conversational. 20 years of investigation, and you managed to piece together more of the truth than I thought possible. Though not quite all of it, I fear." The hall erupted in confusion as armed men began emerging from the crowd, strangers who had somehow infiltrated the celebration, their weapons already drawn. Eirik realized with growing horror that they had been surrounded without knowing it, trapped in their own hall by an enemy they had never seen coming. "Osric," Eirik said quietly, his hand moving toward his sword. "You've been the messenger between our clans for 23 years. Yes, long enough to intercept every important communication, to guide every crucial decision, to ensure that the war between you would never end." Osric smiled, and for the first time, his unremarkable face showed the cold calculation that had been hidden beneath decades of humble servitude. Chief Arnulf's warriors were reaching for their weapons, but Osric's men were already in position throughout the hall. Women and children huddled together as the terrible reality became clear. They were outnumbered and surrounded in their most sacred space. "Why?" Liv demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Why orchestrate so much death and suffering?" "Because war is profitable, Lady Liv. Weapons must be forged, supplies must be purchased, damaged settlements must be rebuilt. I've grown quite wealthy, serving as middleman for these transactions, selling to both sides while ensuring neither could ever achieve decisive victory." Eirik felt rage building in his chest like molten iron. You used our honor against us. You used our love for our people to make us kill each other. I used your predictability, Osric corrected. Warriors are simple creatures, driven by pride and vengeance. Once properly motivated, you could be counted on to make all the wrong choices at precisely the right times. The leather pouch containing Liv's evidence lay on the table between them, its contents representing 20 years of careful investigation and the hope of justice. Now, it seemed like a futile gesture in the face of armed betrayal. "What do you want?" Eirik asked, calculating distances to weapons, counting enemies, assessing the chances of protecting his people. Osric's smile widened. "Why? To finish what I started, of course. Today's ceremony was supposed to seal the peace between your clans, but instead, it will be remembered as the day both chiefs died in a tragic misunderstanding. The war will continue for another generation, and I will continue to profit from your mutual destruction." The ancient marriage hammer still lay forgotten on the floor, where Eirik had dropped it during the ceremony. Now it seemed to mock them, a symbol of sacred union, corrupted by greed and manipulation. The great hall transformed from celebration to battleground in heartbeats. Eirik's hand closed around the hilt of his ceremonial sword, just as the first of Osric's hidden warriors lunged toward the high table. Steel rang against steel as Chief Arnulf drew his own blade, the sound cutting through screams of panicked wedding guests. "Protect the women and children!" Eirik roared, his voice carrying over the chaos. His own warriors, scattered throughout the crowd in their feast clothes, scrambled to respond, but many were unarmed, having left their weapons at the door in respect for the sacred ceremony. Liv moved with surprising speed for someone in heavy wedding robes, snatching up a carving knife from the feast table and backing toward the wall. 20 years of survival had taught her that hiding was often wiser than fighting, but her eyes never left Eirik as he engaged the nearest attacker. Tormund proved that age had not dimmed his warrior's instincts. The old advisor swung his bronze-topped staff in a wide arc, catching one of Osric's men across the temple and dropping him like a felled tree. The ancient oak shaft held firm despite its age, a testament to the craftsman who had shaped it generations before. "How many of them are there?" Chief Arnulf called out, his sword work as precise as it had been in his youth. Blood already stained his ceremonial robes, though whether it was his own or his enemy's was impossible to tell in the chaos. Eirik parried a thrust aimed at his heart, then riposted with a cut that opened his attacker's throat. His mind counted automatically at least 20 hidden warriors, maybe more, positioned throughout the hall with the patience of professional killers. This had been planned for months, perhaps years. "Osric!" he shouted over the clash of weapons. "Face me yourself, you coward! End this between us!" But the scribe had retreated to the relative safety of the hall's entrance, surrounded by his best fighters, while directing the battle like a general commanding from behind the lines. His unremarkable face now showed the cold satisfaction of a man watching his carefully laid plans unfold. "Kill the chiefs first," Osric commanded. "Let the others surrender or die as they choose." The wedding guests huddled in the corners and behind overturned tables, but even the non-combatants were not helpless. Women who had been married to warriors for decades knew which end of a knife was sharp, and several of the older boys had grabbed serving tools to defend their families. Eirik found himself fighting back-to-back with a man who had been his enemy until this morning, Chief Arnulf's eldest son Bjorn, whose skill with a blade rivaled his father's. The irony was not lost on either of them, as they protected each other from attacks that would have succeeded against a single opponent. "Your father spoke truth about the marriage," Eirik said between sword strokes. "This was never about deception between our clans." "Aye," Bjorn replied, his axe cleaving through an attacker's shield arm. "Osric played us all for fools, but that ends today." The battle was slowly turning in their favor. Osric's men were skilled, but they faced warriors defending their homes and families, a motivation that made even the most hardened killer fight with desperate fury. Bodies littered the rushes that covered the hall floor, and the air grew thick with smoke from overturned torches. Liv pressed herself against the wall near the cold hearth, clutching the carving knife with white knuckles. From her position, she could see the entire battle unfolding, including something that made her blood run cold. One of Osric's men was moving purposefully toward the great doors, carrying what looked like a clay pot with smoke rising from it. "Fire!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the battle noise. "They're going to burn the hall." The words struck fear into every heart. Fire was the terror of all who lived in wooden buildings. Once it took hold, there was no stopping it. The great hall would become a funeral pyre for everyone trapped inside. Eirik disengaged from his current opponent and sprinted toward the man with the firepot, but two more of Osric's warriors moved to intercept him. He cut down the first with a stroke that nearly severed the man's arm, but the second managed to land a glancing blow across his ribs before falling to Eirik's return strike. Too late. The clay pot shattered against the wooden wall near the entrance, and flames began to lick hungrily at the ancient timbers. Within moments, the fire would spread to the tapestries and rushes, turning the enclosed space into an oven. "Everyone out!" Tormund bellowed, pointing toward the smaller side exits. "Leave the dead and save the living." But Osric had planned for this too. His remaining warriors positioned themselves to control the exits, forcing the defenders into an impossible choice: stay and burn, or charge through a gauntlet of enemy blades. Eirik felt the heat already growing at his back as he faced this final tactical challenge. The great hall that had been his family's seat for generations was dying around him, and with it, perhaps, the peace that had cost so much to achieve. "The roof!" Liv called out, pointing upward. "The smoke hole!" Every longhouse had an opening in the roof to let out smoke from the central fire. It was narrow, meant only for ventilation, but it represented the one exit Osric had not anticipated. The wooden beams that supported the roof were strong enough to bear a person's weight, if someone could reach them. "Who's the best climber?" Eirik asked, his mind already working through the possibilities. Young Bjorn stepped forward, his face set with determination. "I can make it. Lower a rope for the others once I'm through." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. The flames were spreading faster now, feeding on 20 years of accumulated dust and celebration decorations. Soon, the hall would be an inferno from which no one could escape. The marriage hammer still lay on the stone floor near the altar, its bronze head reflecting the growing firelight. It had been crafted to seal unions and celebrate new beginnings, but now it bore witness to betrayal and burning. Some symbols, Eirik reflected grimly, survived everything, including the destruction of the worlds they were meant to bless. Young Bjorn scaled the carved pillars with the agility of youth, his hands finding purchase on decorative carvings that had been old when his grandfather was born. The smoke hole seemed impossibly distant as flames spread across the wooden walls, turning the great hall into a furnace that threatened to cook them all alive. Below, Eirik and Chief Arnulf organized their desperate defense, using overturned tables as shields while herding the survivors toward the center of the hall. The irony was bitter. The same spot where they had exchanged wedding vows now served as their last refuge against fire and sword. "How long do we have?" Chief Arnulf asked, sweat streaming down his face from heat and exertion. Tormund studied the advancing flames with the eye of a man who had seen many buildings burn. "Minutes. Perhaps less. The old wood is dry as bone. Once the roof beams catch, the whole structure will collapse." Liv pressed close to Eirik's side, her wedding dress torn and stained with ash. In her hands, she still clutched the leather pouch containing evidence of Osric's crimes, refusing to abandon it even as death closed around them. "There's something else you need to know," she said quietly, "about why Osric chose today for this attack." "It can wait," Eirik replied, his eyes tracking the movements of Osric's remaining warriors. They had pulled back from the worst of the flames but still blocked the exits, content to let fire do what their swords had failed to accomplish. "No, it can't." Liv's voice carried urgent conviction. He didn't just want to kill us, he wanted to destroy something specific. The treaty scroll, the one that would formally end the war between our clans. It's here, in the hall. Eirik's gaze snapped to the ceremonial table where the marriage documents had been prepared. Among the scattered parchments was indeed the peace treaty, painstakingly negotiated over months of careful diplomacy. If it burned, the legal foundation for peace would die with them. The treaty means nothing if we're all dead, Chief Arnulf pointed out grimly. But if we survive and it burns, our people will never trust another peace agreement, Liv replied. Osric wins either way. If we die, the war continues out of vengeance. If we live but the treaty is destroyed, the war continues out of suspicion. Above them, Bjorn finally reached the roof beams, his voice echoing down through the thickening smoke. I'm at the smoke hole. Lowering rope now. A braided leather cord dropped through the opening, swaying in the updraft created by the fire. It was barely long enough to reach the floor and far too narrow to allow rapid evacuation of 30 people. They would have to go one at a time, and time was the one resource they lacked. Women and children first, Eirik commanded, but his words were interrupted by a new threat. One of Osric's men had crept close enough to the rope to grab it, threatening to cut their only escape route. Tormund moved with surprising speed for his age, his bronze-topped staff connecting with the enemy's skull in a blow that echoed like a hammer on an anvil. The man dropped, but others were moving to take his place, realizing that controlling the rope meant controlling who lived and who died. I'll get the treaty, Liv said, already moving toward the ceremonial table before Eirik could stop her. The flames were closest there, and the heat was becoming unbearable, but she moved through the danger with the determination of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. Eirik wanted to go after her, but his attention was demanded by Osric's final gambit. The scribe had emerged from his protective circle of warriors, carrying in his hands an object that made Eirik's heart sink, a war horn, carved from the tusk of a great whale, marked with the runes of summoning. You think this ends here? Osric called out over the roar of flames. I have 3 ships waiting offshore, filled with mercenaries who will finish what we started. When this horn sounds, they will land and slaughter everyone in your settlement. Your wives, your children, your elders, all will pay for your interference with my plans. The threat was real. Eirik could picture his people, scattered throughout the settlement in their homes and workshops, defenseless against a coordinated attack by professional killers. The wedding guests trapped in the burning hall were only the beginning of the massacre Osric had planned. Unless, the scribe continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man holding all the advantages, you surrender now. Lay down your weapons, and I will call off the attack. Your people will live, even if you do not. Several of the defenders looked to Eirik with desperate hope in their eyes. The choice seemed impossible, certain death for themselves or possible survival for their families. It was the kind of decision that had no good answers, only degrees of loss. Liv reappeared through the smoke, clutching the treaty scroll and several other documents to her chest. Her face was streaked with soot, and the hem of her wedding dress smouldered from proximity to the flames, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. Don't listen to him, she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. I found something else among the papers, a contract between Osric and his mercenaries. They're not just here to kill us. They're here to burn the entire settlement and blame it on a raid by unknown enemies. No one survives, no matter what we do. The revelation changed everything. Surrender would not save their people. It would only make them easier targets for slaughter. Osric's offer of mercy was just another lie in a web of deception that stretched back 20 years. Then we make our own fate, Eirik said grimly, raising his sword despite the hopelessness of their situation. Around him, the survivors of 2 clans who had been enemies that morning stood together against a common threat that sought to destroy them all. The rope swayed in the firelight, offering escape to a precious few while promising death to the rest. Above them, young Bjorn waited at the smoke hole, ready to pull up whoever could reach him. Below, Osric raised the war horn to his lips, preparing to summon the force that would complete his genocidal plan. Time, like hope, was running out. The war horn never reached Osric's lips. A crossbow bolt sprouted from his chest like a deadly flower, the bronze point punching through his ribs with enough force to spin him around. The whale-tusk horn clattered to the floor as he collapsed, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. From the smoke-filled entrance to the great hall stepped a figure that made every surviving warrior gasp in recognition. Magnus Ironforge, Liv's supposedly dead husband, emerged from the chaos like a ghost given flesh. He was older, greyer, marked by 20 years of hard living, but unmistakably alive. "Forgive my lateness," Magnus said quietly, lowering his crossbow. "I had to deal with Osric's ships first." The hall fell silent, except for the crackling of flames and the drip of blood from wounded men. Eirik stared at the man whose death he had carried like a stone in his heart for 2 decades. Magnus had been a skilled smith, a man of peace who had died defending his family. Except, apparently, he had not died at all. Magnus, Liv's voice broke on the name, the treaty scroll forgotten in her hands. "But I saw you fall. I saw the fire take the smithy with you inside." The man who had been her husband moved closer, his weathered face showing a mixture of love and regret that was painful to witness. "You saw what I needed you to see. When the raiders broke through the palisade, I knew the settlement was lost. I had seconds to choose die fighting uselessly, or survive to protect what mattered most." Eirik found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "Your son. Where is your son?" Magnus's eyes met his across the burning hall, and for a moment 2 men who had been shaped by the same tragedy faced each other with understanding that transcended words. Safe, hidden where Osric's gold could never reach him, raised by good people who believed his parents died in the raid. The implications crashed through Eirik's mind like an avalanche. "You've been alive for 20 years. While I carried the guilt of your deaths, while I let that guilt drive me to make choices that cost more lives. While we gathered the evidence to prove what really happened," Liv interrupted gently, "while we tracked down every connection, every payment, every message that Osric intercepted or altered. We couldn't reveal ourselves until we had enough proof to destroy his entire network." Magnus stepped over Osric's body without ceremony, his attention focused on the spreading fire that threatened to consume them all. "This conversation can wait until we're not about to burn alive. The settlement is secure. I brought enough men to deal with Osric's mercenaries, but we need to get everyone out of this hall before the roof comes down." As if summoned by his words, new figures appeared at the entrances to the hall. These were not Osric's hired killers, but warriors, bearing the symbols of a dozen different clans, all united under Magnus's leadership. They moved with the efficiency of soldiers who had planned this rescue carefully, cutting down the remaining enemy fighters and securing escape routes. "How?" Chief Arnulf demanded, his sword still ready despite the changed circumstances. "How did you coordinate all this without our knowledge?" "Because you weren't meant to know," Magnus replied simply. Osric had spies everywhere, people who reported on every negotiation, every message, every plan. The only way to defeat him was to let him think he was winning until the very last moment. Young Bjorn called down from the smoke hole, his voice tight with urgency. "The roof beams are starting to sag. If you're coming up, it has to be now." But the need for escape through the narrow opening had passed. Magnus's warriors were already organizing evacuation through the cleared exits, helping the wounded and guiding the survivors to safety. The great hall might burn, but the people within it would live. Eirik stood amid the chaos, his world reordered once again by revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew. The guilt that had driven him for 20 years was built on carefully constructed lies. The peace treaty in Liv's hands was not the first attempt at ending the feud. It was the culmination of decades of secret work by people who had sacrificed their own lives to make it possible. "There's something else," Liv said quietly, moving to stand beside him as the evacuation continued around them. "Our son, yours and mine, the one I was carrying when I left you, he didn't die in the raid." The words hit Eirik like a physical blow. His son, the child he had never known existed, whom he had assumed died with Liv in the flames of Vallenheim. Where is he? He's grown now, a man of 20 winters, trained as both warrior and smith. He's been helping us gather evidence, working under a false name in settlements across both territories. Liv's eyes searched his face for understanding. He wanted to meet his father, but we couldn't risk exposing him until Osric was dead. Magnus approached them, his expression grave but not hostile. The three people whose lives had been torn apart by deception now faced each other in the smoke and firelight, their relationships forever changed by the truth. "I know this is difficult," Magnus said carefully, "but there's no time for lengthy explanations. Osric's death doesn't end the threat. He was part of a larger network of profiteers who have been manipulating conflicts across the northern lands. We need to move quickly to expose them before they can regroup." The leather pouch containing Liv's evidence remained clutched in her free hand, its contents representing years of dangerous investigation. But now Eirik understood that it was only part of a much larger collection of proof that would reshape the political landscape of their world. "The treaty," he said, gesturing to the scroll Liv still held. "Is it genuine, or another deception?" "It's real," Chief Arnulf confirmed. "The marriage was meant to be the final seal on an agreement that both our clans genuinely want. The only deception was in the identity of the bride." Tormund emerged from the smoke, his bronze-topped staff supporting an injured warrior. The old advisor's eyes took in the transformed situation with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had lived through many unexpected turns of fate. "Well," he said dryly, "I suppose this explains why the gods seemed so interested in your wedding day, Eirik. They rarely arrange such elaborate revelations for ordinary ceremonies." The roof beams groaned ominously overhead, reminding them that divine intervention could only accomplish so much against the laws of fire and physics. The great hall that had sheltered Eirik's family for generations was dying, but from its ashes, something new was being born, a truth that had the power to reshape their entire world. As they moved toward the exits, Eirik caught a glimpse of the marriage hammer still lying where he had dropped it during the ceremony. The ancient bronze head reflected the firelight like a beacon, its blessing somehow intact despite the destruction surrounding it. Some symbols, he realized, were stronger than the buildings that housed them. The settlement transformed into a war camp within hours of escaping the burning hall. Magnus had brought 40 seasoned warriors from across the northern territories, men who had fought under different banners but united under a single purpose, ending the network of profiteers who had manipulated their conflicts for decades. Eirik stood in his armory, strapping on leather and steel that had served him through countless battles. But this felt different from any war he had ever waged. For 20 years he had fought enemies he could see, for reasons he understood. Now he faced a web of corruption that stretched across territories he had never visited, involving people whose names he had never heard. "The main stronghold is 3 days' march northeast," Magnus explained, spreading a detailed map across the wooden table. His knowledge of geography was impressive for a man who was supposed to have been dead for 2 decades. Grimvar's hold, built into a mountain pass where he can control trade between the eastern and western settlements. "Grimvar, the merchant?" Chief Arnulf asked, his weathered face showing recognition. "I've dealt with him many times over the years. Weapons, supplies, even information about enemy movements. He always seemed to know exactly what each side needed." "Because he was creating the need," Liv said quietly. She had changed from her ruined wedding dress into practical traveling clothes, leather breeches, and a wool tunic that made her look more like the woman Eirik remembered from their youth. Every weapon he sold to you, he sold an equal number to your enemies. Every piece of intelligence he provided was carefully calculated to escalate conflicts, not end them. Tormund entered the armory carrying his bronze-topped staff and a leather satchel that clinked with metal. "I've gathered what remains of the marriage gifts and treaty documents. If we're riding to war again, we should at least know what we're fighting to preserve." The old advisor's words carried weight that went beyond their immediate meaning. Peace was more than the absence of war. It was trust, built between people who had been taught to hate each other. The ceremony that morning had been disrupted, but its purpose remained vital to the future of their clans. "There's something you need to understand about Grimvar," Magnus continued, his voice growing darker. "He's not just a merchant who got greedy. He's a former war chief himself, exiled from his own clan 15 years ago for crimes so severe that his own people drove him out. He's been building his own army ever since, using mercenaries and cutthroats drawn from every failed warrior band in the north. Young Bjorn, who had proven his courage during the escape from the burning hall, stepped forward with the eager determination of youth. "How many men does he have?" "At least 200, possibly more," Magnus replied grimly. "Well-armed, well-supplied, and positioned in a fortress that has never been taken by direct assault. This won't be a battle, it will be a siege that could last months." Eirik studied the map, his experienced eye noting the defensive advantages of Grimvar's position. The mountain pass was narrow, easily defended, with steep slopes on both sides that would make flanking maneuvers nearly impossible. Worse, the approaching winter would make a lengthy siege deadly for the attackers. "We don't have months," he said finally. "Our people need to prepare for winter, not spend it camped outside an enemy stronghold. There has to be another way." "There is," Liv said, though her voice carried reluctance. "Grimvar has a weakness that Magnus and I discovered during our investigation. He has a daughter, his only child, whom he loves more than his own life. She's been living in secret at a monastery 2 days south of here, hidden from his enemies who might use her against him." The implication hung heavy in the air. Taking hostages was an old tactic in warfare, but it left a bitter taste in the mouths of honorable warriors. Using an innocent woman as leverage against her father seemed too close to the methods they were fighting against. "No," Eirik said firmly. "We don't win this war by becoming like our enemies. If we have to siege the stronghold, then we siege it properly." "Even if it means more good people die?" Chief Arnulf asked quietly. "Even if it means our own people suffer through a winter of war instead of peace?" The question struck at the heart of leadership, the terrible mathematics of weighing certain losses against possible gains. Eirik had made such calculations countless times, but they never became easier, only more familiar. Magnus leaned over the map, pointing to a series of marks that indicated supply routes. "There might be a third option. Grimvar's fortress is strong, but it depends entirely on supplies brought up from the lowlands. If we could cut those supply lines, force him to come out and fight on ground of our choosing, the winter passes will be snowed in within weeks," Tormund interrupted. "Once blocked, they won't clear until spring. If we're going to do this, it has to be soon." A commotion outside the armory drew their attention. Through the small window, they could see riders approaching the settlement under a banner of truce. The lead horseman was richly dressed, his cloak trimmed with fur that spoke of wealth and position. "Grimvar's colours," Magnus said grimly. "He knows we're coming." The messenger was a young man with the soft features of someone who had never known real hardship. He dismounted with the careful precision of court training, then approached the gathered leaders with a scroll sealed in blue wax. "Eirik Bearblood," he announced formally, "I bring greetings from my master Grimvar Irongold, and terms for the resolution of your current difficulties." Eirik accepted the scroll but did not break the seal immediately. "Speak your message plainly. We have little patience for flowery words." The messenger cleared his throat nervously. My master acknowledges that certain irregularities have come to light regarding past business arrangements. He wishes to negotiate a settlement that would be beneficial to all parties. What kind of settlement? Chief Arnulf demanded. Complete cessation of all previous activities, along with compensation for any perceived damages. In exchange, my master would retain his current holdings and be allowed to retire from active involvement in territorial conflicts. The offer was almost insultingly inadequate. 20 years of manipulated warfare, thousands of deaths, countless families destroyed, and Grimvar wanted to buy his way out of consequences with gold. And if we refuse? Liv asked, her voice carrying the edge of someone who had sacrificed too much to accept easy compromises. The messenger's composure wavered slightly. My master has taken certain precautions to ensure his own security. He holds several prominent individuals from various clans as his guests, and their continued well-being depends upon reasonable negotiations. Hostages. Grimvar had anticipated their discovery and taken insurance in the form of innocent lives. The calculation became even more complex: rescue the hostages and risk alerting him to their plans, or proceed with the attack, knowing that good people might die for their justice. How long do we have to consider these terms? Eirik asked, though his mind was already working through alternatives. 3 days, the messenger replied. After that, my master's offer expires, and he will be forced to take more definitive action regarding his current situation. As the messenger departed, the War Council reconvened with new urgency. The comfortable weight of planning and preparation had been replaced by the crushing pressure of impossible deadlines and innocent lives hanging in the balance. "He's forcing our hand," Magnus said quietly, "making us choose between justice and mercy." "Then we choose both," Eirik replied, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had found his path. "We rescue the hostages and destroy Grimvar's operation, not one or the other, both." "That's impossible with the forces we have," Chief Arnulf protested. "We'd need to split our strength, and neither group would be sufficient for their task." Eirik smiled grimly, remembering lessons learned in a lifetime of warfare. Impossible odds are what separate great victories from ordinary ones. Gather the men we have plans to make and very little time to make them. Outside, the sun was setting over the settlement, painting the sky the color of forge fire. Tomorrow, they would ride toward a confrontation that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of peace in the northern lands. The marriage hammer, salvaged from the ruins of the Great Hall, sat on the table beside the war plans, a reminder that some ceremonies, like some promises, were too important to be destroyed by fire or sword. Dawn broke grey and cold over Grimvar's hold, the ancient fortress carved into the mountain face like a scar against the stone. Eirik crouched in the pine forest below the pass, watching the sentries pace their walls with the discipline of professional soldiers. Beside him, Magnus checked his crossbow with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on its accuracy. 2 groups, as planned, Eirik whispered to the warriors gathered around him. Magnus leads 15 men to the monastery, rescue the hostages, and get them to safety. I take the rest to the main gates. We wait for Magnus's signal before beginning the assault. Chief Arnulf adjusted his mail shirt, the metal links singing softly in the morning air. "And if the signal never comes? Then we make enough noise to draw every enemy away from the hostages," Eirik replied grimly. "Sometimes the best rescue is the loudest distraction." Liv emerged from the shadows carrying a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Inside was the marriage hammer, its bronze head gleaming despite the grey light. She had insisted on bringing it, claiming that some ceremonies required completion regardless of circumstances. "Are you certain about this?" she asked quietly, her eyes reflecting 20 years of accumulated worry. "Once we attack, there's no turning back. Win or lose, everything changes." Eirik touched the hammer's ancient handle, feeling the weight of generations of chiefs who had wielded it to seal sacred oaths. "Some things are worth the risk of losing everything." Peace between our people is one of them. The sound of hoofbeats echoed from the monastery direction, Magnus's group departing on their desperate rescue mission. They would approach from the south, using merchant disguises to get close before revealing their true purpose. Success depended on speed, surprise, and the kind of luck that gods granted to righteous causes. "Remember," Tormund said, his bronze-topped staff planted firmly in the frozen ground, "we're not here to conquer territory or claim treasure. We're here to end a corruption that has poisoned our lands for 20 years. Fight with that purpose, and the gods will guide your weapons." The old advisor's words carried the weight of ritual blessing, but also practical wisdom. Warriors fought differently when they believed in their cause, harder, longer, with less regard for personal safety. Such men could achieve victories that seemed impossible to more cautious opponents. Bjorn approached, carrying a horn carved from elk antler, its surface decorated with runes of summoning. "When do we sound the charge?" "When the monastery bells ring," Eirik replied. "Magnus will signal their success or failure. Either way, we attack immediately afterward." The waiting began, that peculiar torture known to every warrior before battle, when time stretched like heated metal and every heartbeat felt like a hammer blow. Men checked weapons, adjusted armor, and spoke quietly to whatever gods they favored. Some carved runes of protection into tree bark, while others simply stared at the fortress walls and calculated angles of attack. Eirik found himself thinking about the son he had never known, a young man of 20 winters who was somewhere in these mountains, helping to gather evidence that would reshape the political landscape of their world. Did he have Eirik's blue eyes, Liv's stubborn chin, the courage of both his parents, or the wisdom to avoid unnecessary battles? A distant bell began to toll, not the celebratory peal of victory, but the urgent clang of alarm. Something had gone wrong at the monastery. "Magnus is in trouble," Chief Arnulf said grimly. "That's not the signal we were expecting." Eirik stood, his hand moving to his sword hilt. The plan was failing before it had truly begun, but hesitation would only make things worse. Sometimes a leader had to charge into darkness and trust that his people would follow. "Sound the horn," he commanded. "All of it depends on us now." Bjorn raised the elk horn to his lips and blew a blast that echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. The sound was answered immediately by war cries from 40 throats as the combined forces of 2 clans charged up the narrow path toward Grimvar's gates. Arrows flew from the fortress walls, but the attackers had shields and determination. They reached the outer defenses as crossbow bolts shattered against oak planks and iron rims. The defenders had advantage of position, but they faced warriors fighting for the future of their children, motivation that made even superior numbers seem insufficient. "Bring up the ram," Eirik shouted, pointing toward the massive log that 6 men carried between them. The gates were iron-bound oak, ancient and strong, but no barrier was absolute when struck with sufficient force and determination. The first blow against the gates rang like a giant bell, the second splintered wood along the edges, the third, the gates exploded outward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. But instead of defending the breach, Grimvar's men were retreating deeper into the fortress, drawing the attackers into narrow passages where superior numbers meant nothing. "It's a trap," Tormund warned, his staff pointing toward murder holes in the ceiling above. "They want us inside." Eirik raised the marriage hammer high, its bronze head catching what little light filtered through the grey sky. "Then we spring the trap and break it from within. Forward!" The fortress interior was a maze of narrow corridors and sudden drops designed to break any assault into manageable fragments. Eirik led his warriors deeper into the stone passages, the marriage hammer in one hand and his sword in the other, both weapons singing through air thick with the smoke of torches and the copper scent of spilled blood. Grimvar's trap was more sophisticated than simple murder holes and falling stones. As they pressed forward, doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off retreat while channeling the attackers toward a single destination, the great hall at the fortress heart, where the merchant prince waited with his personal guard. "We're being herded like sheep," Chief Arnulf muttered, but his sword never wavered as it cut down another defender. "Then we'll be the kind of sheep that bite back," Eirik replied, ducking under a crossbow bolt that sparked off the stone wall behind him. The final corridor opened into a circular chamber carved from living rock, its domed ceiling supported by pillars that had stood since the fortress was built. Grimvar Iron Gold sat on a throne carved from a single block of granite, his bulk making even the massive chair seem small. Around him stood 20 men in full mail, their shields locked and spears levelled. But it was the figures kneeling at the base of the throne that made Eirik's blood run cold. Magnus knelt there with his hands bound, blood streaming from a head wound that spoke of fierce fighting. Beside him were the hostages, an elderly woman who bore the marks of nobility, 2 young men who looked like brothers, and a teenage girl whose defiant expression reminded Eirik painfully of Liv in her youth. "Welcome, Eirik Bearblood," Grimvar called out, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man holding all the advantages. "I trust you received my message about negotiations?" "I received it," Eirik replied, stepping into the chamber with his surviving warriors behind him. They were outnumbered now, tired from the fighting in the corridors, but their weapons remained steady. "I came to give you my answer personally." Grimvar smiled, the expression making his scarred face even more grotesque. "And what answer is that?" Eirik raised the marriage hammer, its bronze head reflecting the torchlight like captured fire. "That some ceremonies are too sacred to be disrupted by thieves and murderers." The merchant prince laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls like breaking glass. "You speak of ceremonies? You've come here to complete a wedding that was built on lies and deception. Your bride was married to another man, your peace treaty was negotiated under false pretenses, and your entire war was choreographed for my profit. The lies were yours, not ours," Liv said quietly, stepping out from behind Eirik, where she had remained hidden during the assault. In her hands she carried not weapons but documents, the evidence they had gathered over 20 years of careful investigation. Every intercepted message, every altered report, every false flag attack that escalated our conflicts. Grimvar's confidence wavered for the first time. Those documents proved nothing. The word of a supposedly dead woman against a respected merchant. Who would believe such tales? "Everyone who reads this," Tormund announced from the chamber entrance, his bronze-topped staff supporting a young man who bore an unmistakable resemblance to both Eirik and Liv. The old advisor held high a scroll bearing multiple clan seals. "The confession of your lieutenant, Osric, signed before witnesses and sealed by the authority of 6 clan chiefs." The young man stepped forward despite his obvious exhaustion, his blue eyes meeting Eirik's with recognition that needed no words. This was his son, Eirik Magnusson, raised in secret but bearing the courage of both his bloodlines. "I was at the monastery when Magnus arrived," Eirik said, his voice steady despite his youth. "I helped free the hostages and fought beside him when Grimvar's men attacked. The evidence we gathered there confirms everything in these documents." The merchant prince's face twisted with rage as his carefully constructed plans crumbled around him. "Kill them all!" he roared to his guards. "Let the gods sort out truth from lies." The final battle erupted with the fury of 20 years of suppressed vengeance. Steel rang against steel in the confined space as warriors who had been enemies that morning fought side by side against a common foe. The marriage hammer proved as effective a weapon as any sword, its bronze head crushing skulls and shattering shields with the weight of ancestral blessing. Magnus, freed by his son's quick knife work, rejoined the battle despite his wounds. The hostages, no longer helpless, grabbed weapons from fallen guards and added their own desperate strength to the fight. Grimvar himself proved to be more than a soft merchant. His exile from his original clan had been for violence, not weakness, and his sword work showed the skill that had kept him alive through years of dangerous schemes. But one man, however skilled, could not stand against the combined fury of those he had wronged. As Eirik's sword found his heart, Grimvar fell with the expression of someone who had finally run out of tricks and time. The chamber fell silent, except for the labored breathing of exhausted warriors and the drip of blood on ancient stone. The autumn sun painted the rebuilt great hall in shades of gold and amber, its light filtering through new windows that replaced the smoke-blackened openings destroyed in the fire. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Grimvar's hold, and the settlement bore the marks of both destruction and renewal. Fresh timber gleaming beside weathered planks, new tapestries hanging alongside those salvaged from the flames. Eirik stood at the altar where his marriage had begun so dramatically, but this time he was not alone. Liv waited beside him, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the depth of her eyes, while Tormund prepared to complete the ceremony that fire and treachery had interrupted. The marriage hammer rested on the oak altar, its bronze head polished to mirror brightness, a symbol of continuity that had survived war, deception, and time itself. The hall was filled again with representatives from both clans, but the atmosphere carried none of the tension that had marked the original ceremony. Children who had hidden in terror during the battle now ran between the tables, their laughter echoing off the new rafters. Warriors who had bled together in Grimvar's fortress sat side by side, sharing ale and stories as if they had been brothers all their lives. 23 years ago, Tormund began, his bronze-topped staff tapping against the floor with ceremonial rhythm. A young man and woman pledged their love beside a moonlit lake. Today we gather to honor that promise, delayed but not diminished by the trials they have endured. Eirik Magnusson, now openly acknowledged as Eirik Eiriksson, stood with the other witnesses, his young face bearing the solemn dignity of someone who had learned hard truths about family and sacrifice. Beside him, Magnus watched with the complex expression of a man who had given up his claim to happiness for a greater cause. The peace treaty lay open on a side table, its parchment covered with the signatures and seals of a dozen clan chiefs who had gathered to witness not just a wedding, but the formal end of hostilities that had cost thousands of lives. The document had been rewritten to include provisions for trade agreements, shared defense pacts, and the establishment of neutral territories where disputes could be settled through law rather than warfare. Do you, Eirik Bearblood, take this woman as wife, to protect and cherish, to honor and support, through whatever trials the gods may send? Eirik's voice carried clearly through the hall, steady with the certainty of a man who had found his true path after decades of searching. I do so swear, before the gods and before these witnesses. Do you, Liv Ragnardotir, take this man as husband, to counsel and companion, to honor and follow, through whatever joys and sorrows await? Liv's answer came without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Eirik's face. I do so swear, knowing the weight of such promises, and choosing to bear them gladly. Tormund raised the marriage hammer high, its ancient bronze catching the autumn light. By hammer blessed and oath sworn, by fire tested and blood shared, I proclaim you joined in the sight of gods and men. Let none put asunder what has been bound in truth and love. The hall erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the new timbers, but Eirik heard only the sound of his own heart as Liv's hand found his. They had been apart for 23 years, separated by deception and the cruel games of others, but the connection between them felt as strong as if no time had passed at all. Chief Arnulf rose from his place at the high table, a drinking horn filled with mead raised in salute. To the peace that has cost us so much to achieve, and to the marriages that make such peace possible. The toast was echoed throughout the hall, but the celebration that followed was quieter than the original feast had been planned to be. These people had learned the value of what they were celebrating, not just the union of two lives, but the end of a war that had consumed their world for too long. As the evening deepened and the feast wound toward its close, Eirik found himself on the familiar platform overlooking the settlement, much as he had been on the morning that changed everything. But this time he was not alone. Liv stood beside him, her hand warm in his, while Eirik leaned against the railing with the easy confidence of youth that has been tested and not found wanting. "What happens now?" Eirik asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than anxiety. "The war is over. The conspirators are dead or scattered. What does a war chief do during peacetime?" Eirik smiled, remembering asking similar questions to his own father decades before. "He learns to be something else. A builder instead of a destroyer. A teacher instead of a commander. A man who settles disputes with words rather than swords." Below them, the settlement showed signs of the prosperity that peace would bring. New workshops were under construction, trade goods filled the warehouses, and children played in courtyards without fear of sudden violence. The marriage of two people had become the marriage of communities, creating bonds that would strengthen with each passing year. "I've been thinking about the future," Liv said quietly, her gaze following the path of the river as it wound toward the sea. "About the children who will grow up in this peace we've bought with so much pain. They'll need to know the story, all of it, the good and the bad, so they can recognize the signs if someone tries to manipulate them as we were manipulated." Tormund approached from the stairs, his staff tapping against the wooden planks with familiar rhythm. In his free hand, he carried a leather scroll case that bore the bronze raven seal of Eirik's family. "The scribes have finished the official record," the old advisor announced. "The whole story, from the first intercepted messages to the final battle at Grimvar's Hold. Future generations will know what it cost to achieve this peace." Eirik accepted the scroll case, feeling the weight of documented truth within. Some stories needed to be preserved not for glory, but for wisdom warnings against the seductive lies that could turn honorable people into unwitting tools of others' greed. The marriage hammer had returned to its place of honor in the great hall, waiting to bless future unions between people who would never know the fear that had shaped their parents' lives. Some ceremonies, Eirik reflected, were worth any sacrifice to preserve.